Lieutenant Sarah Chen had always been the kind of person who noticed things others missed. Growing up in San Francisco's Chinatown, she learned to read people's faces, to catch whispered conversations in multiple languages, and to spot trouble before it found her. These skills made her perfect for military intelligence work, though she never imagined they would one day save thousands of lives. The year was 1943, and the Pacific War raged across countless islands. Sarah had volunteered for the Women's Army, corps against her parents' wishes. They wanted their daughter safe at home, working in the family restaurant not halfway around the world in a war zone. But Sarah felt a calling stronger than family expectations. Her country needed her, and she had skills that could make a difference. At 24, Sarah was assigned to a top-secret intelligence unit operating in the Philippines. The Japanese had occupied the islands since 1942, and Allied forces desperately needed information about enemy positions, troop movements, and fortifications. Sarah's job was to coordinate with local resistance fighters and gather intelligence that would help plan the eventual liberation of the Philippines. The intelligence unit operated from a hidden base deep in the jungle of Mindanao. Sarah worked alongside 12 other specialists, including radio operators, code breakers, and field agents. Their commanding officer, Colonel James Murphy, was a veteran of the First World War who understood the value of good intelligence. He trusted his team completely and gave them freedom to operate as they saw fit. Sarah's particular talent was building relationships with local Filipino resistance fighters. She had studied Tagalog before her deployment and picked up enough Cebuano to communicate effectively. More importantly, she treated the Filipino fighters as equals, not as subordinates. This respect earned her their trust in ways that many American officers never achieved. The resistance network on Mindanao was extensive but fragmented. Different groups operated independently, sometimes working at cross purposes. Sarah's mission was to help coordinate their efforts while gathering intelligence about Japanese activities across the island. She spent weeks traveling between different camps, building relationships, and establishing communication networks. One particular resistance leader, Captain Rodriguez, became Sarah's closest ally. Rodriguez had been a teacher before the war, but took up arms when the Japanese executed several of his students for refusing to bow to the Japanese flag. He commanded a group of 40 fighters who knew every trail and hiding spot in their region of the island. Through Rodriguez and other resistance contacts, Sarah began building a comprehensive picture of Japanese defenses in the Philippines. She learned about hidden airfields, supply depots, and troop concentrations. Most importantly, she discovered that the Japanese were constructing a major fortress on the northern coast of Mindanao, one that could pose a serious threat to any Allied invasion. The intelligence work was dangerous and exhausting. Sarah often spent days hiking through dense jungle, sleeping in hidden camps and meeting with resistance fighters who risked their lives to provide information. She learned to move silently through the forest, to distinguish between safe and dangerous sounds, and to trust her instincts about people and situations. Communication with Allied headquarters was sporadic and risky. Radio transmissions could be intercepted by Japanese forces, so Sarah's team used a complex system of coded messages and scheduled transmission times. Sometimes weeks would pass without contact, leaving the intelligence team feeling isolated and vulnerable. As months passed, Sarah's network of contacts grew stronger and more reliable. She developed a system for verifying information from multiple sources before passing it along to headquarters. This careful approach ensured that the intelligence was accurate and actionable, even if it sometimes meant slower reporting. The work took its toll on everyone in the unit. The constant stress of operating behind enemy lines, combined with the tropical climate and limited supplies, wore down even the strongest soldiers. 2 members of Sarah's team had already been evacuated due to tropical diseases, and everyone suffered from malnutrition and exhaustion. Despite these challenges, Sarah thrived in the environment. She found purpose in the work and satisfaction in knowing that her efforts were contributing to the war effort. The relationships she built with Filipino fighters gave her a deep appreciation for their courage and sacrifice. These people had lost everything to the Japanese occupation, but continued fighting for their freedom. In early 1944, Sarah received orders for a particularly dangerous mission. Allied commanders were planning a major offensive in the central Philippines, but they needed detailed information about Japanese defenses on several key islands. Sarah would lead a small team to gather this intelligence, working directly with resistance fighters on each island. The mission would require traveling by small boat between islands, a journey fraught with danger from Japanese patrols and unpredictable weather. Sarah would be accompanied by 2 other intelligence specialists and a Filipino guide who knew the waters intimately. They would have minimal equipment and no backup support. Before departing on this critical mission, Sarah wrote a letter to her parents, though she couldn't send it due to security restrictions. In it, she tried to explain why this work mattered to her and why she had chosen to serve far from home. She wrote about the Filipino fighters she had met, their courage and determination, and her hope that the war would end soon with Allied victory. Colonel Murphy personally briefed Sarah on the mission objectives. The intelligence she gathered would be crucial for planning the liberation of the Philippines, potentially saving thousands of American and Filipino lives. The colonel emphasized both the importance of the mission and its extreme danger, giving Sarah one final chance to decline. Sarah accepted without hesitation. She had spent months building the networks and relationships necessary for this kind of mission. Her Filipino contacts trusted her completely, and she had proven her ability to operate effectively behind enemy lines. This mission represented everything she had trained for and worked toward. On a moonless night in March 1944, Sarah and her small team departed from their jungle base, beginning a journey that would take them deep into Japanese-occupied territory. None of them knew that this mission would soon go terribly wrong, leading to Sarah being declared missing in action and presumed dead. They certainly couldn't imagine that the intelligence Sarah would eventually gather would prove decisive in winning the Pacific War. The mission began smoothly enough. Sarah's team traveled by night in a small fishing boat provided by the resistance, navigating between islands using stars and landmarks that their Filipino guide knew by heart. During the day, they hid in caves or dense jungle, avoiding Japanese patrols that regularly swept the coastal areas. Their first stop was the island of Bohol, where they met with a resistance group led by a former police chief named Captain Santos. Santos had been organizing sabotage operations against Japanese supply lines and had valuable information about enemy positions. He showed Sarah detailed maps that his fighters had created, marking Japanese bunkers, ammunition dumps, and patrol routes. Sarah spent 3 days on Bohol verifying the information and adding her own observations. She noticed that the Japanese were building new fortifications along the eastern coast, suggesting they expected an Allied attack from that direction. This intelligence would be crucial for invasion planners, who could now adjust their approach. Accordingly, the team's next destination was Leyte, a larger island with a more complex Japanese presence. The journey required crossing open water during daylight hours, a dangerous necessity due to tide schedules. Sarah's guide assured her that Japanese patrol boats rarely ventured into the rough waters between the islands, but everyone remained tense throughout the crossing. On Leyte, Sarah connected with a resistance network that had been operating since the Japanese invasion. The group was led by a former school principal named Maria Gonzalez, a woman whose quiet determination reminded Sarah of her own mother. Gonzalez had organized the resistance into efficient cells that gathered information while maintaining strict security protocols. Through Gonzalez's network, Sarah learned about a massive Japanese supply depot hidden in the island's interior. The depot contained ammunition, fuel, and food supplies for thousands of troops. More importantly, Sarah discovered that the Japanese were secretly moving their best units to defensive positions on Luzon, the main island of the Philippines. This information was so significant that Sarah decided to risk a radio transmission to Allied headquarters. Using a portable radio and code system, she sent a brief message detailing the troop movements and supply depot location. The transmission lasted only minutes, but it was long enough for Japanese radio detection equipment to get a rough bearing on their position. Within hours, Japanese search teams began combing the area where Sarah's team was hiding. The resistance fighters helped them move to a new location, but it was clear that their presence had been detected. Sarah faced a difficult decision: abort the mission and return to base, or continue despite the increased danger. Sarah chose to continue. The intelligence she was gathering was too valuable to abandon, and she felt responsible to the resistance fighters who were risking everything to help her. However, she sent one team member back to base with the information already collected, ensuring that at least some of their work would reach Allied commanders. The next phase of the mission required traveling to Samar, an island known for its dense jungle and fierce resistance fighters. The Japanese had struggled to control Samar since the invasion, facing constant guerrilla attacks from fighters who knew every inch of the terrain. Sarah hoped to connect with these groups and learn about Japanese defensive preparations on the island. The journey to Samar nearly ended in disaster. A Japanese patrol boat spotted their fishing vessel and gave chase, forcing Sarah's guide to navigate into dangerous coral reefs where the larger patrol boat couldn't follow. They escaped, but their boat was damaged and taking on water. They barely reached shore before the vessel sank completely. Stranded on a small uninhabited island between Leyte and Samar, Sarah's reduced team faced a serious problem. They had lost their transportation, most of their supplies, and their radio equipment. Worse, they were now in an area that Japanese forces patrolled regularly. Their Filipino guide was injured during the rough landing and needed medical attention for 3 days. They hid in caves while Sarah treated the guide's injuries with their limited medical supplies. They survived on coconuts and rainwater while watching Japanese boats patrol the surrounding waters. Sarah began to wonder if they would ever make it off the island alive. Their salvation came from an unexpected source. A group of Filipino fishermen discovered them while checking nets near the island. Initially suspicious, the fishermen became helpful allies once they learned about Sarah's mission. They provided food, water, and eventually transportation to Samar in their own boats. On Samar, Sarah connected with the most effective resistance group she had yet encountered. Led by a former Army sergeant named Lieutenant Cruz, these fighters had developed sophisticated intelligence networks and communication systems. They had detailed information about Japanese positions across multiple islands and had been waiting for contact with Allied forces. Cruz showed Sarah evidence that the Japanese were constructing a series of interconnected fortresses across the central Philippines. These positions were designed to channel any Allied invasion into kill zones, where Japanese forces could inflict maximum casualties. The defensive network was more extensive and sophisticated than Allied intelligence had realized. Sarah spent 2 weeks on Samar, working with Cruz's fighters to map the Japanese defensive network. She learned about hidden artillery positions, underground bunkers, and prepared demolition points that would destroy bridges and roads during an Allied advance. This intelligence would be invaluable for invasion planners. However, the extended time on Samar also increased the danger. Japanese forces had been searching for Sarah's team since the radio transmission from Leyte, and they were closing in on the resistance networks that had been helping her. Cruz warned Sarah that a major Japanese operation was being planned to eliminate resistance groups across the central Philippines. The warning came too late. On Sarah's 14th day on Samar, Japanese forces launched a coordinated attack on resistance camps across the island. Cruz's group came under heavy assault from aircraft and ground troops, forcing them to scatter into the jungle. Sarah found herself separated from her remaining team member and completely cut off from any support. Alone in the jungle with only basic supplies, Sarah faced the most dangerous phase of her mission. Japanese search teams were actively hunting for her, offering rewards to local informants. The resistance networks she had worked with were broken and scattered. Her radio was lost, her transportation was gone, and she had no way to contact Allied forces. For the first time since beginning her mission, Sarah began to doubt whether she would survive. She was hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, with no support and no clear way home. The Japanese knew she was in the area and were determined to capture her. Even if she survived, there was no guarantee that the crucial intelligence she had gathered would ever reach Allied commanders. As Japanese search operations intensified around her position, Sarah made a desperate decision. Instead of trying to escape or hide, she would continue her mission. If she was going to be trapped behind enemy lines anyway, she would use the time to gather even more intelligence. The information she was collecting was too important to abandon, even if it cost her life. Sarah's first priority was survival, but she quickly realized that simply hiding in the jungle would accomplish nothing. The intelligence she had gathered was too important to die with her. She needed to find a way to continue collecting information while evading capture, and eventually find a way to get that information to Allied forces. Moving only at night, Sarah began a careful journey deeper into Japanese-occupied territory. She followed animal trails and creek beds, avoiding the main paths that Japanese patrols used. Her training in jungle survival, combined with techniques learned from Filipino resistance fighters, kept her alive during those first desperate weeks. Food was her biggest challenge. Sarah knew which plants were safe to eat and how to trap small animals, but finding enough nutrition to maintain her strength was difficult. She lost weight rapidly and struggled with tropical diseases that her depleted immune system couldn't fight effectively. Several times, fever and exhaustion nearly killed her. Despite her physical deterioration, Sarah continued gathering intelligence. She observed Japanese convoys moving along coastal roads, noting the types of vehicles and equipment being transported. She counted troops at various outposts and mapped the locations of new defensive positions being constructed. Every piece of information was carefully recorded in a waterproof notebook she kept hidden in her clothing. 3 weeks after being separated from her team, Sarah encountered a group of Filipino civilians who had been forced to work for the Japanese. These laborers were building new bunkers and defensive positions, and they had access to information about Japanese military operations. After careful observation, Sarah approached the group's leader, an elderly man named Eduardo. Eduardo was initially terrified when Sarah revealed her identity, fearing that helping an American would result in execution for his entire family. However, Sarah's fluent Tagalog and respectful manner gradually won his trust. Eduardo agreed to share information about the construction projects he was overseeing, providing Sarah with detailed intelligence about Japanese defensive preparations. Through Eduardo's network of forced laborers, Sarah learned about the full scope of Japanese defensive plans in the central Philippines. The enemy was not just building individual fortresses, but creating an integrated network of positions that would allow them to coordinate resistance to any Allied invasion. The network included underground tunnels, hidden artillery positions, and elaborate camouflage systems. More disturbing was the intelligence about Japanese intentions if their positions became untenable. Eduardo revealed that Japanese commanders had ordered the execution of all Allied prisoners and Filipino collaborators if an invasion appeared imminent. This information was crucial for Allied planners, who needed to consider the humanitarian implications of their military operations. Sarah spent a month working with Eduardo's network, gathering intelligence while helping them subtly sabotage the construction projects they were forced to complete. They mixed sand with concrete to weaken bunker walls, provided incorrect measurements that made defensive positions less effective, and delayed construction schedules whenever possible. The intelligence work took a severe toll on Sarah's health. She was suffering from malaria, dysentery, and infected wounds from insect bites and jungle thorns. Without proper medical treatment, her condition steadily worsened. Eduardo and his workers shared what food and medicine they could spare, but their own resources were limited. As Sarah's health deteriorated, she faced a grim reality. She might not survive to deliver the intelligence she had gathered, but the information was too important to lose. She began creating multiple copies of her notes, hiding them in different locations and giving copies to trusted members of Eduardo's network. If she died, perhaps someone else could eventually get the information to Allied forces. The situation became even more desperate when Japanese security forces began investigating the sabotage of construction projects. They suspected that resistance fighters were infiltrating the labor gangs and began conducting random searches and interrogations. Several of Eduardo's workers were arrested, and under torture they provided information that led Japanese forces closer to Sarah's location. Realizing that her presence was endangering the Filipino workers who had helped her, Sarah decided to leave Eduardo's network and continue on her own. Eduardo begged her to stay, arguing that she would die alone in the jungle, but Sarah refused to risk any more Filipino lives. She took only basic supplies and her most important intelligence notes, leaving the rest with Eduardo's most trusted lieutenant. Alone again, Sarah's condition rapidly worsened. The combination of disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion left her barely able to walk. She hallucinated frequently and sometimes lost consciousness for hours at a time. Several times she collapsed on jungle trails and awoke hours later, unsure of where she was or how much time had passed. During one of these episodes, Sarah was discovered by a Japanese patrol. Too weak to run or hide effectively, she was captured while unconscious beside a stream where she had collapsed while trying to get water. The Japanese soldiers found her intelligence notes and immediately recognized their significance. Sarah was taken to a prison camp for interrogation. The interrogation center was located in a converted school building in a coastal town on Samar. Japanese intelligence officers, assisted by interpreters and torture specialists, attempted to extract information about Allied invasion plans and resistance networks. They were particularly interested in learning about the Filipino fighters who had helped Sarah and the extent of American intelligence operations in the Philippines. Sarah endured weeks of interrogation and torture, but she revealed nothing of value to her captors. Her training and resistance to interrogation helped, but more importantly, her commitment to protecting the Filipino fighters who had risked everything to help her gave her strength to endure the abuse. She provided false information designed to mislead Japanese forces while protecting her allies. The Japanese were puzzled by Sarah's extensive knowledge of their defensive positions and military operations. They couldn't understand how a single American intelligence officer had penetrated so deeply into their territory and gathered such detailed information. Their own security procedures seemed adequate, yet somehow Sarah had learned their most closely guarded secrets. Unknown to her captors, Sarah was also gathering intelligence during her imprisonment. She observed guard routines, noted the presence of high-ranking Japanese officers, and listened to conversations that revealed information about enemy plans. Even while being tortured, she was working to complete her mission. After 6 weeks of interrogation failed to break Sarah, Japanese commanders decided to transfer her to a more secure facility on Luzon. They planned to use her as leverage in potential prisoner exchanges, or as a source of propaganda if she could be persuaded to cooperate. The transfer would involve a dangerous journey by ship through waters where Allied submarines were increasingly active. The night before her scheduled transfer, resistance fighters attacked the prison facility in an attempt to rescue Sarah and other Allied prisoners. The attack was led by Lieutenant Cruz, who had survived the earlier Japanese assault on his camp and spent weeks tracking Sarah's location. The raid was partially successful, freeing several prisoners, but Sarah was not among them. During the chaos of the rescue attempt, Sarah managed to escape from her cell, but Japanese guards recaptured her before she could reach the rescue team. However, she was able to pass a message to one of the rescued prisoners, a Filipino resistance fighter who had been captured weeks earlier. The message contained crucial intelligence about Japanese defensive plans and the location of hidden weapons stockpiles. The transport ship carrying Sarah to Luzon never reached its destination. 2 days after leaving Samar, the vessel was torpedoed by an American submarine while traveling through the San Bernardino Strait. The explosion killed most of the Japanese guards and crew, but also created chaos that Sarah used to her advantage. In the confusion following the torpedo strike, Sarah found herself in the water with dozens of other survivors. The ship was sinking rapidly, and Japanese guards were more concerned with their own survival than maintaining control over their prisoners. Sarah's swimming skills, developed during childhood summers at San Francisco beaches, served her well in the treacherous waters. She swam away from the main group of survivors, knowing that Japanese rescue efforts would focus on saving their own personnel first. Using debris from the destroyed ship as flotation, Sarah struck out toward the nearest island several miles away. The swim took most of the night, and she nearly drowned twice when exhaustion overcame her. Sarah washed ashore on a small, uninhabited island covered with dense vegetation. She was severely dehydrated, exhausted, and suffering from saltwater poisoning. But she was alive and free. More importantly, she still had her waterproof intelligence notes, which had survived both her imprisonment and the shipwreck. Recovery on the island took several days. Sarah found fresh water in natural rock pools and ate coconuts and small fish caught in tidal pools. Gradually, her strength returned, though she remained dangerously thin and weakened by months of captivity and abuse. Her most pressing concern was finding a way off the island and back to Allied territory. After a week of recovery, Sarah spotted fishing boats in the waters around her island. She carefully observed them for several days, trying to determine whether they were operated by Filipinos or Japanese. Eventually, she took the risk of signaling one of the boats, revealing herself to fishermen who turned out to be members of a resistance network. The fishermen were amazed to discover an American intelligence officer on the remote island. They had heard rumors about a female American agent who had been captured by the Japanese, but believed she had been executed. Sarah's survival and escape seemed almost miraculous to these men, who had witnessed the brutal efficiency of Japanese security operations. Through the fishermen, Sarah reconnected with resistance networks that had been rebuilt after the Japanese crackdown. She learned that her intelligence work had already had significant impact, even though she had been presumed dead. The information passed through Eduardo's workers, and the rescued prisoner had reached Allied commanders, who were using it to plan their invasion of the Philippines. However, Sarah's most valuable intelligence was still in her possession. The detailed maps and observations she had made during months behind enemy lines provided a complete picture of Japanese defensive preparations. This information would be crucial for the success of any Allied invasion, potentially saving thousands of American and Filipino lives. The challenge now was getting this intelligence to Allied headquarters. Radio communication was dangerous and unreliable, and Sarah's written notes were too detailed to transmit safely. She needed to find a way to reach Allied territory in person, carrying the physical documents that contained her most important discoveries. The Resistance Network proposed a daring plan. A small group of their most experienced fighters would escort Sarah across multiple islands, eventually reaching Mindanao, where Allied forces were known to be operating. The journey would cover hundreds of miles through Japanese-occupied territory, requiring weeks of dangerous travel. Sarah accepted the plan despite its risks. She had survived this long and gathered too much valuable intelligence to give up now. The Filipino fighters volunteering to escort her were risking their lives for the chance to strike a meaningful blow against the Japanese occupation. Their courage and dedication reminded Sarah why she had chosen this dangerous work. The journey began with a night crossing to a larger island, where the resistance had established safe houses. Sarah traveled disguised as a Filipino woman, wearing local clothing and keeping her head covered to hide her distinctive features. The disguise was imperfect, but in the darkness and confusion of wartime it was sufficient to avoid casual detection. On each island they visited, Sarah continued gathering intelligence even while trying to reach Allied lines. She observed new Japanese positions, noted changes in enemy patrol patterns, and collected information about recent troop movements. Her escort team was amazed by her dedication to the mission, despite her weakened condition. The most dangerous part of the journey was crossing the Mindanao Sea, a body of water heavily patrolled by Japanese naval forces. The resistance had arranged for a larger boat operated by experienced smugglers who regularly moved people and supplies between islands, despite Japanese control efforts. The crossing took place during a storm that made travel treacherous, but also provided cover from Japanese patrols. Sarah spent the journey fighting seasickness while protecting her intelligence documents from water damage. She had wrapped them in multiple layers of waterproof material, but the storm tested every precaution she had taken. After 2 days at sea, they reached the coast of Mindanao near Cagayan. Sarah was back on the island where her mission had begun over a year earlier, but she was still hundreds of miles from Allied territory. The final phase of her journey would require traveling overland through some of the most dangerous territory in the Philippines. The overland journey took 3 weeks, with Sarah's team moving only at night and hiding during daylight hours. They followed jungle trails known only to local guides, avoiding roads and villages where Japanese forces maintained a presence. Several times they had to detour around areas where Japanese sweep operations were in progress. During this final phase of her journey, Sarah witnessed the extent of Japanese brutality against Filipino civilians. Entire villages had been destroyed in retaliation for resistance activities, and the surviving population lived in constant fear. These observations strengthened Sarah's resolve to ensure that her intelligence reached Allied commanders who could use it to liberate the Philippines. As they approached areas controlled by Allied forces, Sarah's escort team began encountering other resistance groups and eventually made contact with American advisors working with Filipino guerrillas. Word of Sarah's survival spread quickly through the resistance networks, eventually reaching the ears of Colonel Murphy, who had long ago given up hope of seeing his intelligence officer again. The reunion with Allied forces was emotional but brief. Sarah immediately began debriefing sessions with intelligence officers, sharing the detailed information she had gathered during her months behind enemy lines. The scope and quality of her intelligence amazed even experienced officers who had seen many intelligence reports from occupied territory. Sarah's information revealed the full extent of Japanese defensive preparations in the Philippines. She had mapped fortress networks, identified key command posts, located hidden supply depots, and documented troop dispositions across multiple islands. Most importantly, she had learned about Japanese plans to execute prisoners and collaborators if an invasion seemed imminent. Within days of Sarah's return, Allied commanders were revising their invasion plans based on her intelligence. They adjusted landing sites to avoid the strongest Japanese positions, planned preliminary bombardments to target the most important defensive installations, and prepared special operations to rescue prisoners before Japanese forces could carry out their execution orders. The Allied invasion of Leyte began on October 20, 1944, just 3 weeks after Sarah's return from behind enemy lines. General MacArthur waited ashore at Red Beach, fulfilling his famous promise to return to the Philippines. But the success of that landing and the broader liberation campaign that followed owed much to the intelligence that Sarah had gathered during her months in Japanese-occupied territory. Sarah watched the invasion preparations from Allied headquarters on Mindanao, where she continued working despite her weakened condition. Military doctors had ordered complete rest to allow her body to recover from months of malnutrition and abuse, but Sarah insisted on participating in the planning process. Her detailed knowledge of Japanese positions was too valuable to ignore. The invasion fleet was massive, comprising over 700 ships and 200,000 troops. Sarah felt overwhelming emotion watching the armada depart, knowing that the men aboard those vessels were benefiting from intelligence she had risked everything to gather. The beaches they would assault, the defenses they would face, and the tactics they would use had all been influenced by her work. The initial landings on Leyte succeeded beyond Allied expectations. Japanese defensive positions that should have inflicted heavy casualties were bypassed or neutralized through precise preliminary bombardments. Supply depots that Sarah had identified were captured intact, providing valuable resources for the advancing American forces. Her intelligence had given Allied commanders a decisive advantage. More importantly, special operations teams used Sarah's information to locate and rescue Allied prisoners before Japanese forces could execute them. 3 separate prison camps were liberated in coordinated raids timed to coincide with the main invasion. Over 500 Allied prisoners and 2,000 Filipino civilians were saved from certain death. Sarah's intelligence also proved crucial in countering Japanese reinforcement efforts. She had identified key transportation hubs and supply routes that Japanese forces would need to move troops from other islands. Allied air and naval forces targeted these choke points, severely limiting Japanese ability to reinforce their defenders on Leyte. The battle for Leyte lasted until December 1944, but the outcome was never in doubt after the successful initial landings. Japanese forces, cut off from reinforcement and facing constant attacks on positions Sarah had mapped, gradually collapsed. The island was declared secure on December 25th, Christmas Day, 1944. During the Lady Campaign, Sarah continued working with intelligence teams to interpret captured Japanese documents and interrogate prisoners. Her understanding of Japanese defensive doctrine, gained through months of observation, helped Allied forces anticipate enemy tactics and countermoves. She had become one of the foremost experts on Japanese military operations in the Philippines. The success on Leyte led directly to the invasion of Luzon, the main island of the Philippines, in January 1945. Once again, Sarah's intelligence proved invaluable. She had mapped Japanese defensive positions around Manila Bay and identified the location of massive underground fortifications that could have devastated Allied landing forces. The liberation of Manila was particularly satisfying for Sarah, who had witnessed Japanese brutality toward Filipino civilians during her time behind enemy lines. When American forces entered the city in February 1945, they found evidence of massacres and destruction that confirmed Sarah's reports about Japanese intentions toward the civilian population. Sarah's work didn't end with the liberation of the Philippines. Military intelligence officers recognized that her methods and insights could be valuable in planning the invasion of Japan itself. She was promoted to major and assigned to help plan intelligence operations for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of the Japanese home islands. The intelligence preparations for invading Japan were massive in scope, involving thousands of personnel and requiring detailed understanding of Japanese defensive capabilities. Sarah's experience operating behind enemy lines and building networks with local resistance fighters became a model for planned operations in Japan. However, the invasion of Japan never took place. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in August 1945, followed by the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, convinced Emperor Hirohito to surrender. The war ended on August 15, 1945, making Operation Downfall unnecessary. The war's end brought mixed emotions for Sarah. She was relieved that no more lives would be lost, but she also felt a sense of anticlimax after years of intense, dangerous work. The skills she had developed and the networks she had built were suddenly obsolete, replaced by the need for reconstruction and peacetime activities. Sarah remained in the Philippines for several months after the war's end, helping to establish civil affairs operations and assisting in the repatriation of prisoners and displaced persons. She worked closely with Filipino officials to rebuild governmental institutions destroyed during the Japanese occupation. During this period, Sarah was reunited with many of the resistance fighters who had helped her during her time behind enemy lines. Eduardo, the forced laborer who had shared intelligence about Japanese construction projects, survived the war and was able to thank Sarah personally for helping to liberate his country. Lieutenant Cruz, the resistance leader from Samar, had also survived and was working with American forces to hunt down Japanese war criminals. He told Sarah that her intelligence had helped his fighters avoid several Japanese traps, saving dozens of lives. The respect and gratitude of these men meant more to Sarah than any official recognition she received. Sarah's contributions to the war effort were eventually recognized through multiple decorations, including the Distinguished Service Cross, the Bronze Star, and the Philippine Liberation Medal. More meaningful to her were the letters she received from soldiers whose lives had been saved by the intelligence she gathered. One letter came from a young Marine who had participated in the late landings. He wrote that his unit had been warned about a specific Japanese ambush position based on intelligence reports, allowing them to avoid a trap that would have resulted in heavy casualties. The young man wanted to thank whoever had provided that life-saving information. Another letter came from the family of an Allied prisoner who had been rescued from a Japanese prison camp. The rescue operation had been planned using intelligence about camp locations that Sarah had gathered during her time behind enemy lines. The freed prisoner had returned home safely to his wife and children. These personal testimonies convinced Sarah that her sacrifices had been worthwhile. The months of danger, the torture and imprisonment, the near-death experiences in the jungle, all of it had served a purpose. The intelligence she gathered had saved lives and helped win the war. As the Philippines recovered from years of occupation and warfare, Sarah began considering her own future. The war had changed her profoundly, giving her experiences and perspectives that few people could understand. She had proven her courage and capabilities under extreme circumstances, but now faced the challenge of finding purpose in a peaceful world. The Army offered Sarah opportunities to remain in military intelligence, but she felt called to use her experiences in different ways. She had witnessed the courage and sacrifice of Filipino resistance fighters and wanted to help ensure that their contributions to victory were not forgotten. The bonds she had formed with these brave men and women would influence the rest of her life. Sarah returned to the United States in early 1946, but the America she found was very different from the one she had left in 1943. The country was celebrating victory and transitioning to peacetime prosperity. But Sarah struggled to adjust to civilian life after her harrowing experiences in the Philippines. The quiet streets of San Francisco felt strange after years in war zones. Her family welcomed her home with joy and relief, having long believed she was dead. The official notification of her missing in action status had arrived in 1944, followed months later by a presumed dead classification. Her parents had held a memorial service, and her mother still kept Sarah's bedroom exactly as she had left it, refusing to believe their daughter was gone forever. The reunion was emotional but complicated. Sarah's parents wanted their daughter to return to the person she had been before the war, but that young woman no longer existed. The experiences of operating behind enemy lines, surviving capture and torture, and gathering intelligence that helped win the war had fundamentally changed Sarah's perspective on life and her place in the world. Sarah found it difficult to discuss her wartime experiences with family and friends who had no frame of reference for what she had endured. The classified nature of her work also limited what she could share, leaving her feeling isolated even among people who loved her. She often felt more comfortable with other veterans who understood the challenges of readjusting to civilian life. The physical effects of her wartime service were also evident. Sarah had lost significant weight and strength during her months in the jungle in Japanese captivity. She continued to suffer from recurring malaria attacks and digestive problems caused by malnutrition and tropical diseases. These health issues served as constant reminders of her wartime experiences. Despite these challenges, Sarah was determined to build a meaningful peacetime life. She used the GI Bill to attend law school at the University of California, inspired by her desire to help people who couldn't help themselves. Her wartime experiences had shown her the importance of justice and the rule of law in protecting vulnerable populations. Law school proved challenging in unexpected ways. Sarah was one of only a handful of women in her class, and she often faced skepticism from professors and classmates who questioned whether women belonged in the legal profession. Her military service earned some respect, but many people were uncomfortable with the idea of women in combat roles. Sarah excelled academically despite these social challenges, graduating near the top of her class in 1950. Her law school thesis examined the legal frameworks for protecting civilians during military occupations, drawing on her first-hand observations of Japanese violations of international law in the Philippines. The work was so impressive that it was published in a legal journal. After graduation, Sarah joined a San Francisco law firm specializing in immigration and civil rights cases. She found particular satisfaction in helping Filipino veterans who had fought alongside American forces but were denied citizenship and benefits after the war. Her language skills and understanding of Filipino culture made her uniquely qualified for this work. Through her legal practice, Sarah maintained connections with many of the resistance fighters she had worked with during the war. She helped several of them immigrate to the United States and provided legal assistance to others seeking compensation for wartime damages. These relationships kept her connected to the Filipino community and reminded her of the bonds forged during their shared struggle. In 1952, Sarah married Robert Martinez, a Mexican-American veteran who had served in the Pacific Theater. Robert understood the challenges of readjusting to civilian life and supported Sarah's commitment to helping other veterans. Their marriage was built on mutual respect and shared values developed through wartime service. Sarah and Robert had 2 children, a daughter born in 1954 and a son born in 1957. Sarah was determined to be present for her children while continuing her legal work, a balance that was challenging in an era when working mothers faced significant social pressure. She often brought her children to the office and involved them in community activities related to veteran affairs. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Sarah became increasingly involved in efforts to document and preserve the history of American intelligence operations during World War II. She testified before congressional committees investigating wartime intelligence activities and contributed to official histories of the Pacific War. Her experiences provided valuable insights into the human dimension of intelligence work. Sarah also worked to ensure that the contributions of Filipino resistance fighters were properly recognized. She lobbied Congress to grant citizenship and veterans benefits to Filipinos who had served with American forces, a cause that achieved partial success with the Immigration Act of 1965. Her advocacy helped hundreds of Filipino veterans gain recognition for their service. In 1968, Sarah was invited to return to the Philippines for the 25th anniversary of the Japanese surrender. The trip was emotional and meaningful, allowing her to visit many of the locations where she had operated during the war. She was honored as a hero by the Philippine government and reunited with surviving members of the resistance networks she had worked with. During this visit, Sarah met with Eduardo, the forced laborer who had helped her gather intelligence about Japanese construction projects. Now in his 70s, Eduardo had become a successful businessman and community leader. He credited his survival and post-war success to the hope that Sarah's presence had given him during the darkest days of the occupation. The Philippines trip also allowed Sarah to visit sites where major battles had taken place using her intelligence. She stood on the beaches of Leyte where American forces had landed, knowing that her information had helped reduce casualties during those operations. The experience provided a sense of closure and validation for the sacrifices she had made decades earlier. Sarah retired from legal practice in 1980 but remained active in veteran affairs and historical preservation activities. She established a scholarship fund for Filipino-American students pursuing legal careers and continued advocating for recognition of Filipino contributions to Allied victory in World War II. Her dedication to these causes reflected her lifelong commitment to justice and equality. In her later years, Sarah began writing memoirs about her wartime experiences, working with military historians to ensure accuracy while protecting information that remained classified. The book, published in 1995, became a bestseller and introduced new generations to the story of intelligence operations in the Pacific War. Sarah lived to age 98, passing away peacefully in 2017 surrounded by family and friends. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched through her legal work, advocacy, and friendship. Representatives from the Philippine government attended to honor her contributions to their country's liberation. Her legacy extended far beyond her wartime service, though that remained the defining experience of her life. Sarah had shown that courage and determination could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and that intelligence and compassion were as important as weapons in winning wars. The network she built and the relationships she maintained demonstrated the enduring power of human connections forged in shared struggle. The intelligence that Sarah gathered during her months behind enemy lines had indeed helped win the war, saving thousands of lives and shortening the conflict. But perhaps more importantly, her example inspired others to serve their country and fight for justice throughout her long and meaningful life. She had been declared missing and presumed dead, only to return with information that changed the course of history and a commitment to service that lasted until her final day.